So you've heard about AngularJS, but you're not exactly sure how to get started with it. Well, this video is for you. AngularJS Fundamentals in 60-ish minutes is going to go through all the key fundamentals you need to know about the AngularJS SPA framework. My name is Dan Wallin, and I'll be walking you through some of the fundamentals, some of the key things I really like, and my blog can be found here at weblogs.esp.net/dwallin. And if you're on Twitter, feel free to follow me at Dan Wallin and keep in touch that way. So to get started, we're going to be focusing 100% on AngularJS, and the demos I'm going to be showing throughout this can be found here, tinyurl.com/AngularJS demos. Now I have some real simple demos to start things out, and then we'll build up, and then by the end, we'll kind of put all the main pieces together. Now I'm not going to have time in 60-ish minutes to go through an entire full-scale line of business type of app, but you can absolutely build those types of apps with AngularJS. Now, if you're new to Angular and you haven't really read much about it, you can go to angularjs.org to get all the details. This includes documentation, demonstrations, tutorials, all that fun stuff. Now, the first time I went there, I was really excited about it. I had heard about it from a friend, and I haven't really been on the SPA single-page application bandwagon because I just felt it was too much of a mess. There's too many scripts involved, and you have all these different things you need to deal with. So I was pretty excited about Angular because it really is, you'll see, kind of a SPA framework. And the first time I went and looked at the docs, I'll have to say not a lot of light bulbs went off. And so it felt a little bit strange, and the more I looked into it, it got a little bit stranger in parts. And I saw these different words like transclusion and scope and directive, and I said, what the heck is this? In fact, I wasn't even sure transclusion was an actual word, but turns out it is. So I kind of felt like this guy. I won't say I shed a tear, but I was a little frustrated because I've been doing JavaScript since the 90s, and usually I pick up on stuff pretty quickly, so I figured, well, maybe I'm stupid. Well, it turns out I just wasn't thinking about it the right way and how they approached it. And once I took a step back, kind of relaxed a little bit and said, hey, this can't be as hard as I'm making it, chilled out a little, I realized, wow, this is awesome. And AngularJS truly, in my opinion, is an awesome framework. And so a lot of light bulbs went off. And once that started happening, all the kind of pieces fit in. It made total sense to me. So I think it's like anything. With a new framework, sometimes you catch it, maybe instantly when you learn it, and other times you don't. With this, it was just more of a matter, I hadn't taken the time, to be real honest, to research the different pieces. And I was kind of learning little tidbits here and there. So what I'm going to do throughout this video is walk you through all the key things that I wish I would have understood more up front, and hopefully jumpstart your AngularJS development process. Once you get done, you're going to have superpowers, just like this kid here, and maybe not force powers, but super SPA powers, we'll say, single page application powers. Now, the agenda is we're going to start off with some of the key features AngularJS offers, and I'll kind of introduce the challenge with writing SPAs from scratch. Anyone that knows me knows I do not recommend writing them from scratch. I just think it is, in the long term, when it comes to maintenance, a nightmare. There's too many scripts involved, and I'm worried about version dependencies and scripts changing and things breaking. So we're going to talk about that and how Angular addresses it. From there, we're going to get started with some of the fundamental features that Angular provides. Then I'll go into some of those key features that you really got to start off with, kind of the ABCs of Angular, if you will. So directives, filters, and the two-way data binding, which is just awesome. Now, I'm a big fan of some of the other scripts out there, like Knockout.js as an example, but you're going to see that Angular is a true framework. It's not just a library that does maybe one or two things. It actually can do a lot of different things. Once we get through the directives, filters, and data binding, we're going to talk about views, controllers, and scope. And then we'll wrap up with modules, and we'll talk about how all this other stuff fits into modules. And then we'll get into some SPA concepts like routes and even factories for sharing data and reusing data. So how do you get started with AngularJS, and why do you want to get started? I mean, what features does it offer that are that compelling? Well, we're going to talk about that in this particular section. So first off, a single page application is one in which we have a shell page and we can load multiple views into that. So a traditional app, as you know, you typically blink and, well, it loads everything again. And so it's not very efficient on the bandwidth, especially in the mobile world. And with a SPA, we can load the initial content up front, and then the different views or the little kind of mini web pages can then be loaded on the fly and embedded into the shell page. Now, AngularJS is, you're going to see, a very good SPA framework, but it's not just for that. You don't have to load these dynamic views with it. In fact, if you wanted, you could just use it for some of the cool separation of code that I'll show you and data binding. But I will focus on SPAs here. Now, the challenge with building SPAs from scratch is there's a lot of different issues to deal with. DOM manipulation and history, and how do you dynamically load modules and deal with promises when you make async calls and things like that. Routing becomes a huge issue because you have to have some way to track where are we and where are we going. Well, all of this type of stuff you're going to see is built into Angular. Now, we could certainly do all this with different scripts out there. We could use Sammy.js and jQuery and History.js and Require.js, and for Ajax we could do Q, and there's a lot of different options. But Angular, you're going to see, provides a lot of cool features. It's one core library that I really like that concept because I don't have to rely on a million other scripts and worrying about those different script versions playing nicely into the future. And if you work on a development team, then maintenance should be some type of a goal for you, especially if you do the maintenance. Angular, I think, gives a nice solid core that you can build on top of. Now, what are some of the features? Well, as mentioned, it's really a full-featured SPA framework, and it does all kinds of good stuff. We have two-way data binding. We have the whole model view controller concept. Routing of the views I mentioned into the shell pages is done through built-in routing support, and I'll show how to do that in this video. Testing was designed right from the beginning, so you can build some very robust tests if you'd like, which is obviously recommended. For DOM manipulation, JQLite is built in, which is kind of a mini-me of jQuery. And if you want to use more advanced DOM stuff, you can even use jQuery, and they play really nice together, Angular and jQuery. When it comes to data binding, we have full support for templates, histories built in, we can share code through factories and services and other things. And then there's even more. We have the concept of data binding with view models, directives I'm going to be talking about in the next section, which is a way to teach HTML new tricks, validation, dynamically injecting different features at runtime through dependency injection, and much, much more. So these are just some of the core features, and these features will satisfy some of the others I mentioned when it comes to building a SPA. Now, building that from scratch, of course, could be a challenge. Not so hard here. So let's go ahead and run off to the AngularJS page real fast, and I'll show you how we can get started with it. And then in the next section, we'll jump into some of the key starting features. So to get started with AngularJS, just head over to angularjs.org. And you can notice here, I can go to GitHub, and I can actually get to all the scripts there, or I can just hit download, which is very simple. And then there's two different options here. I can go with the stable or the unstable. If you want cutting edge, click on unstable. I actually use it all the time and have had really good luck with that. But stable would be the official recommended release if you're doing a production app. And then we can go with the minified, uncompressed, or a zip version. Now, you also have access to a CDN. Now, the CDN will give you access around the world to kind of regional data centers that, in this case, Google hosts. And then we'd also potentially get some caching benefits, some parallelism benefits of browsers being able to load different scripts because they're different domains. And there's actually some good benefits by going with the CDN if you wanted. But for now, I'm just going to go with stable and minified and download it. And this is just going to give me this Angular min.js, you'll see. And now what I'm going to do from here is just plop it into a web page. And that's all I have to do to get started. So you'll notice I've already added that in, angular.min.js, and we're ready to go. Now, it's not going to do much right now, but that's going to lead us in nicely to the next section, which will be directives, data binding, and filters. Once you've added the AngularJS script into a page, now you're ready to start using it. And the first thing we're going to talk about is something called directives, a very, very critical and kind of core concept in the AngularJS framework. From there, we're going to talk about filtering data, and we'll talk about data binding. So a lot of cool stuff in this particular section. So to start off, what's a directive? Well, I mentioned this earlier. A directive is really a way to teach HTML new tricks. The web, when it first came out, was really just designed to display static pages. And as we all know, it's become very, very dynamic, and we've dealt with that pretty well. I mean, jQuery came out many years ago, and it provided a way to do it. And even before then, we could do raw vanilla JavaScript. Well, Angular takes it up a whole notch, and it allows us to extend HTML very, very easily by simply adding attributes, elements, or comments. Now, here's an example of using a very basic but very important Angular directive. Notice up here we have ng app. Now, anytime you see ng dash, that is an Angular directive. That's a built-in directive. Now, you can also write custom ones. You can get third-party ones and things like that. Now, this particular directive, though, is very important because the script that's now loaded down here is going to kick off, and this will initialize the Angular app. And right now, we don't have a particular module associated or any other code, but we can still do stuff just by adding ng app. So, for example, this is an example of another directive called ng model. Now, what ng model does is behind the scenes, this is going to add a property up into memory called name into what's called the scope. Now, if you've ever dealt with the concept of a views model, we call it a view model, and Knockout and some other data binding libraries have this concept, then what this is really doing behind the scenes is making an empty view model, but then filling it with a name property. Now, if I want to write out that value, then I can simply come over and add a data binding expression. Now, expressions are really cool because if I wanted to put 1 plus 1 and have it write out the result, I could do that. Now, you can't put conditional logic in here because you shouldn't be putting that type of conditional logic in your views. But out of the box, just by adding the ng app, ng model with a property, as they type into this text box, I can actually bind to that value. And that provides a very cool little feature. So let's go ahead and look at a demonstration of that. So I have a pretty simple web page here. You'll see I already have Angular included. And let's go ahead and start off by saying we'd allow you to type your name. And we'll bump this down. And we're just going to do an input. Type equals text. And we'll leave it at that right now. Now, obviously, if I were to run this, we're not going to see much happen. We're just going to have a good old text box. And as I type, nothing's going to happen. But let's say that as they type, we want to actually write out the value live that they typed. Well, the first thing I need to do is come in and add the ng app directive. So we'll go ahead and do that. And we'll say ng app. Now, if you feel more comfortable, and I do, to be real honest, adding data dash on these, then you can do that. In fact, I could even do data dash equals, and this would still work. And then it will validate against some of the different validators out there. So I'll leave that up to you, but you don't have to put data dash if you don't want. Now, we can come down here. I'm going to say ng model equals name. Now, this is the name of the property. I could have said foo, I could have said fo, fum, whatever I wanted, but we're going to do name here. And again, I'm going to add data dash just because it makes me feel more warm and fuzzy. And then what I want to do is as they type, I would like to bind to the value they type. And because we now made behind the scenes a property up in memory called name, I can now bind to that. And we do that using the double brackets here. So we're using kind of the handlebars or mustache type style of data binding if you've used those script libraries before. And that'll simply write out name as we type it. Now let's go ahead and run this, and you're going to see that although it won't be super, super impressive, it should work for us, and that's all we have to do to get started with Angular. So we'll go ahead and type the name, and there we go. You can see that as I type, it automatically binds it, and that's pretty dang easy, right? So include the ng app, include our data ng model, bind to that model, and this is very primitive. We're going to go much deeper here, but that's how we can get started. Now, the next thing we can do is we can actually iterate through data. So I have another directive here called ng init, and this isn't one that I use a lot in real life apps because we're going to get into controllers and things like that later here in the video, but this is going to give me some initialization data that I want to actually bind to and display. So we can come in and use another directive in Angular called ng repeat. So we're going to say ng repeat, and then I'm going to give a variable here. For each name in the names variable up here, write out that name. Now, in this case, name is not the same thing as I just demonstrated. All right, name is just a variable. If I would have put foo here, then I would bind to foo here. So this provides a very easy way to automatically duplicate LIs. So in this case, we have, 4 names. And so we would get 4 LIs with the name written out automatically. So again, we have the ng app, ng init, these are 2 directives. Then the third is ng repeat, which will simply loop through all the names and then data bind or apply that value into the LI. So let's look at an example of adding that real quick. So we can come back into our web page, and I'm going to do the ng init. So we'll do data ng init equals, and we could say names equals, and we'll give it an array here. So I'll just do a couple names. Let's do John Smith, and of course John Doe, and not to be excluded, Jane Doe. And then we'll end our simple array. So this is something that's kind of a primitive way to initialize some variables with data. Now, if we come down here, let's add a BR with a UL. And now what I can do is add an LI, and I can do ng repeat. So yet another directive, and I can say for each name in names, and we already have name here, so I'm going to call it something different just so it's not confusing. So let's say for each person name in names, then let's go ahead and bind to person name. Very easy, very simple. So we've now initialized our data with the ng init, and now we're going to iterate through the data with the ng repeat, and then we simply give it the name. It's going to put each name into that variable, and then we bind to it. And so if we go ahead and run this, you'll see that we just get a nice little list written out, nothing too fancy, but it does work, and you can see this still works up here as well. Now, when you use directives, one of the nice things you can do is go off to the documentation. One of the best things you need to know about is go to develop and then go to API reference. Now in API reference, you're going to see that right at the top we have different directives. Now there's a whole bunch of these. I'm only showing a very small subset of what's available, but I'll show some others as we move along here. So for instance, if we want to know more about ng repeat, we can click on that, get to some info, get to some different samples of it, and look how it works. There's even some tests on how to actually test a repeater and do that type of thing if you'd like as well. So there's a lot of great stuff you can do with directives, and we'll start to see more of these as we move along. Now the next thing we can do with Angular is apply filters. So let's say that as we bind to maybe a customer name and we do that process, we want to uppercase it. Now, I could uppercase it in my data model, which we get to a little bit later, but an easy way to do this type of thing is to apply an AngularJS filter. So all this will do is this pipe is the separator between the data binding statement and something called a filter. Now, there's a few filters built in. We'll look at that in the documentation once I get into the demo and run off to the web page. Uppercase does uppercase, there's lowercase. You can restrict if you had an array and you want to write out that array, you could restrict it, limit it to say 3 out of maybe 5, whatever it may be. And then when it comes to ng repeat, what's something that something that's very cool is in this case we're going to say for each cust in customers, I want to filter by name text. So up here we have this ng model, which we already looked at. As they type, the value they type will automatically be applied to first filter down the customers based upon what was typed. So if you type DA and Dan was in there, then it'll automatically pick me or any other people that start with DA or have DA in the name. Then we're going to take those results and filter again, and we're going to order those results by a name property. And I'll show this in the demonstration coming up. Now what that'll ultimately do is if we had 50 customers and we filter for all those that have, John in the name, then all the Johns would be shown, and then we would order those by John Doe, John Smith, and that type of thing. So what we're going to do in this case is once that filtering goes through and we order those, we'll then write out the customer name and the customer city. So let's go ahead and jump into a demonstration of doing it this way. So back in our web page, I've changed the ng init a little bit, and instead of just having an array of strings, I have an array of objects. So you'll notice that each object has a name and a city property. And so I just have 3 of these in here. We have John Doe, John Smith, and Jane Doe from San Francisco, New York, and Phoenix. So I'm going to have to change this now. Name still stays the same, but I'm going to go ahead and change that to, and let's just say this was a list of customers. So we'll call it customers. We'll change this to customers then, and we'll change this to, we'll say cust. Now what I'm going to have to do is write out the cust dot, and now we can get into the properties and we can do name here. Then if I wanted, I could come in and put a space and maybe a dash or something, and we could do cust dot city. And now we're going to data bind to both those properties. Now I could even come into here just to show you. I could even do it this way if I wanted, and that would work too, but I'm going to go ahead and break these out into two separate data binding statements. So now we say for each cust in customers, let's go ahead and write out cust name and cust city. Now let me go ahead and let's make sure this works first, and then we'll apply some filters. And it looks like it does. You can see the cities now being written out, but notice as I type, and nothing really happens that's useful or interesting. So what I'm going to do is let's come into here and let's do a filter by, and then whatever they type in the name, instead of data binding to it, I want to use it as a filter. So we're going to filter by the name property that's in our model. So let's go ahead and see if we can get that working and see what happens here first. All right, so let's go ahead and I'll do Smith here, SM. You'll notice when we did S, the S from San Francisco also pulls up because I didn't tell it anything specific, just filter everything. And so we have Smith, we could do Doe, we'll get both of those. We could do New York with a space. There we go. And you can see all that works and it's all live. And then we could even order by. Now let's see if we have things in the right area. Yeah, it looks like if I do John and we want to order by, say, city, then obviously Phoenix is out of place with New York. So we can come in and do another pipe, order by, and now in quotes I give it the property. So let's order by the city, then it will bind those remaining customers and order those by city. So let's go ahead and search for the Johns here. And we'll go ahead and do John, and notice that New York now appears first and Phoenix follows, which of course was not the case in the data. So that's an example of applying not only some data binding and some ng repeat type of directives, but also how we can apply filters and order bys, and I could even do uppercase if I wanted. I could come in and let's say we wanted this one to be uppercase and we wanted the city maybe to be lowercase. Then we could come in and say uppercase and lowercase filters, run it, and now what'll happen is it'll automatically do that for us, as you can see here. Notice though, as I type, we'll do John, it still works. Still does the filter, still filters out and sorts. Jane still works and all that. So these are some of the built-in directives and filters you get out of the box. Now again, if you go off to AngularJS.org, go to API reference, and then scroll on down just a little bit, you'll see a whole list of the filters. So if I had a number that I want to convert into a currency with a $, for instance, or a £, or whatever currency you're in, then I would just say pipe currency, and it would automatically do that. If I had a date and I want to format it a certain way, and you can control that, by the way, you could do pipe date. And there's a lot of different things you can do here. So what's really nice about Angular is not only can we write our own custom directives, but I can even write my own custom filters if I want to get a little more advanced with this. So a very powerful framework, and we've only scratched the surface so far. So what we're going to do next is start talking about the MVC part of Angular, the model, the view, and the controller, and see how that all fits in. In this section, we're going to talk about views, controllers, and a really integral part of Angular called scope, which really another term for that is view model, if you've used that term before. So the way it works in Angular is you have a view, and that's what we've been doing in the previous section with our directives, our filters, and our data binding. But we don't want to put all our logic into the view because it's not very maintainable or testable or all those types of things. So instead, we're going to have a special little JavaScript object, a container called a controller, and the controller will drive things. It's going to control ultimately what data gets bound into the view. If the view passes up data to the controller, it'll handle passing off maybe to a service, which then updates a backend data store. So the glue between the view and the controller is something called the scope. And in Angular, you're going to see a lot of variables or objects that start with $. And so $scope represents the scope object. Now, when I say it's the glue, it literally is the thing that ties the controller to the view. The view doesn't have to know about the controller, and the controller definitely doesn't want to know about the view. Now you'll see that the view can know about the controller because there's a directive for that if you'd like to use it. But the controller itself, to make it testable and keep things loosely coupled, modular, and all that good stuff, shouldn't know anything about the different view. In fact, you should be able to make a controller that you can bind to different views. Maybe you have a mobile view, you have a desktop view, or whatever it may be. So the scope is this glue between them. Now, for folks that have worked with, say, Knockout or some of the different data binding frameworks out there, not just in JavaScript, but other desktop modes and things, you might have heard the term view model. And a view model literally is the model, the data for the view. Well, that's really all the scope is. The scope is our view model, and it's the glue between the view and the controller. So here's an example of a really simple controller called, oddly enough, Simple Controller. Now you'll notice an interesting thing here. In the parameter signature, you'll see that we pass $scope. And this is dependency injection that's built into AngularJS. Now what this is going to do is Angular, when this controller gets used, will automatically inject a scope object in. Now you'll see that from there, we're going to take that object and add a property onto it called customers, which is simply an array of object literals. So we have our same scenario with name and city here. Now what this controller can do then is serve as the source of the data for the view, but the controller again shouldn't know anything about the view. So how would we possibly communicate customers over? Well, that's why we're injecting scope. Scope is going to be that glue between the controller and the view. So if we come up to our view up here, the scope gets injected, and then that scope is going to automatically be bound into the view once the view knows about this controller. So here's what it looks like. You'll notice up here we have an ng controller, simple controller. Well, that'll automatically tie into this. When this gets initialized, the scope gets passed in, but it's empty. Well, we're going to add a customers property. What's going to happen then is this controller will be used by the view. The controller itself, though, isn't going to be called. It's going to go through the scope. Now, the scope implicitly is available, in this case, to this entire div, from the start of the div to the end of the div. Now, look at the ng repeat here. It's the same thing I did earlier in the demos, but in this case, it's binding to the scope's customers property. And so what's going to happen now is the view, because it knows about the controller, automatically gets past the scope. Now Angular does that kind of behind the scenes, just happens automatically. And we're then going to control in our view what properties we want to bind to. In this case, we want to bind to the customers. Now from here, it's standard data binding like we've seen earlier. We bind to the name, we bind to the city, and we're kind of off and running. So let's take a look at an example of how we can create our custom controller here and tie it into our view. So we already have some data up here, but I don't want to use ng init in this case. It might have come maybe from a backend database through an AJAX call, something along those lines. So I'm going to get rid of this ng init, and I'm going to come on down and make my own custom script. Now keep in mind, I'm going to do this inline purely for demo purposes, and I generally like to actually break this out into its own script, and I'll show you that a little bit later when we get into a little more real-life type of app. But for now, let's make our same function like I showed earlier. Simple controller. Now in the docs, you'll often see it abbreviated. Maybe you'll see CTRL or something. I don't like to do that. In fact, I recommend against it. I think you should be pretty explicit with your names, but you can certainly do it whatever way you'd like. So I'm going to spell it out though. And we need the scope because again, that's the glue between this particular object, our function, simple controller, and our view that's got a data bind to it. Now what I'm going to do is tack onto that scope, which right now is just empty, a little customers property. So we'll say customers equals, and then I'll just paste in our object literal here. Now this array of object literals is now going to be bound into the customers, which then get filtered, and we can do all that good stuff. So let me just bump this down so we can see it a little bit better. We've now done the same thing, but if we run this, it's not going to work because the view doesn't know about simple controller. So one way we could fix this is I could come up maybe to the body and we could say ng controller equals, and we can give it simple controller But you could also have different controllers for different parts of a given page. It's the scope would apply only to where you add that controller. So for instance, if I came in and only want the scope to apply here, then anything in this start and end tag here for the div, which would be all these guys, is now in that. So now we actually have two properties in the scope. The ng model is going to add a property into the scope called name. And we can actually get to that now in the controller by saying scope.name. And then of course we have customers, which will be retrieved through the scope as well. So if we run this, now that we've defined the controller, we should see the same exact behavior here. In fact, it still works. All my filters still work. I can type the filter, do New York, if I can type it right. And there we go. So that's an example of a simple controller. Now, in a section that'll be coming up in the video, I'm going to show a different way and what I consider a better way to do it. But again, we're trying to walk through the fundamentals step by step on how to use this. So let's go back and take a look at some other things you can now do. Now that you've seen data binding, directives, filters, and controllers, and you've seen how the scope actually can integrate between a view and a controller, it's now time to really move it up a notch and talk about modularity and some more SPA-oriented concepts like routes. So in this section, we're going to talk about how to create modules and how modules can actually be used to create other things like controllers, routes, factories, and services, and how all this fits together. One of the things I really struggled with when I very first started learning AngularJS was I didn't really see the big picture of how everything fit together. So I'm going to show you a really simple diagram. This is kind of an oversimplification, but I think it breaks it down pretty easily. So a module can have something off of it called a config function, and it can be used to define different routes. Now, routes, again, are really important in the SPA world because if you have different views and those views need to be loaded into the shell page, then we need a way to be able to track what route we're on and what view that's associated with, and then what controller goes with that view, and how do we do all that marrying together of these different pieces. Well, when you define a route in AngularJS, you can define two things on that route, two of the key things, I should say. One of those is the view. So what view when that route, such as if you did /orders, then maybe you go to orders partial.html or orders fragment or whatever you want to call it. And then that view needs a controller. Well, instead of hard coding the controller into the view, which works, and you can certainly do it, I showed that in the previous section, we can actually go in and do this on our own through the route. And this is the way I would definitely recommend you do it. Now, a given controller would then, of course, have access to the scope object, which then the view will bind to. We talked about that a little bit earlier. And then controllers, rather than having all the functionality to get the data and update data and perform CRUD operations and things like that, in a more real-life application, they'll call out to factories, or I put a star there because you might have services, providers, or even values you want to get. There's a lot of different ways you can access data, even resources. Now on the views, we of course then have directives and filters and those types of things. Now there's even more to the overall picture, but this is one of those things I wish I would have seen this right up front, because I would have kind of instantly had that light bulb moment where the light goes on and you go, oh, okay, so you define a route has a controller and a view, and then the controller can load data from factories and services and things. So what we're going to do is talk about each of these individual pieces and how in a single page application you could actually define routes and use those. So the first thing to talk about is, although I created the controller in some previous demos right in the view, that's not the recommended way to do it. Keep in mind, you might actually have different views. You might have a mobile view, maybe you have one specific to iPad or Surface or something like that, and then maybe you have one for desktops. It's very possible. So what we need to do is, when we define our ng app, earlier we didn't assign it to anything. And so what that did is just implicitly created a scope behind the scenes, and it still worked, you saw, with the data binding and the filters and all that good stuff. But we now want to kind of graduate to a more modular application. And Angular is very, very modular if you take advantage of it. So there is a module object, and I'll show you how to create that. You literally just say angular.module, And off of the module, you can configure the routes, create custom filters, custom directives. You can get data from different sources using factories, services, providers, or values, and then you can even create controllers using the module. So you can think of a module as really just an object container, and then in that container, you can have all these different things that you see here. Now, what's important is once the module is given a name, that's when you're going to go into ng app, and whatever the module name is, that's what's going to go here. So they could have just as easily called it ng module, but I actually like ng app, makes sense, I think, and it really just means, hey, what's the name of the module that you've defined in JavaScript? Now here's what it looks like. It's really, really simple to create a module. So once you've referenced the Angular script, you're going to have access to an Angular object. Now, off of this object, you can get to all kinds of good stuff. You can get to the JQLite functionality for jQuery DOM type manipulation, but you can also get, as you see here, to the module. So in this example, you can see I called my module demo app, and then you might wonder, what exactly is the empty array for? And I know I did the first time I saw it. And the answer is this is where dependency injection comes in, because your module might actually rely on other modules to get data. So here's an example of that. We have demo app again. We say, hey, Angular, create me a module called demo app. And then I need to rely on another module. In this case, I just called it helper module. Now this would be some other JavaScript file that you might reference, then has another Angular module. And in the quotes here, you would see helper module. And then it might have maybe just filters and directives in it. And that's all it has. Well, what I'm doing is telling Angular, go find that module, go look it up wherever it is and inject it in and make it available to my controllers and directives and filters and factories and all that stuff that this particular module might have. So it's a very powerful feature. If you've ever used AngularJS or something that's more modular based, then this will kind of ring home with you, I think. If you haven't, though, it's just a very flexible way to, at runtime, dynamically include other modules. Now, here's an example of how we can use that module to actually create a controller. And this is the more, I'd say, official way to create a controller. So you'll notice up top we have our demo app, and we just create that the same way. In this case, we're saying it has no dependencies, empty array. Now, what we're going to do with that module, though, is we're going to use it to define a controller. And we're going to call this, as it shows, simple controller. And notice that I just have an anonymous function here nested inside. So the second parameter here is, okay, so what is the controller object? Well, a function, of course, is an object in JavaScript. So we're going to inject in the scope, and then from there, I do the same exact thing we did before. Now, the key is, once I've defined this, I then need to go in and make sure that my ng app points up to demo app in the strings. And then I could even in the view do ng controller, like I did earlier, is simple controller. Now, once we get to routes here, I'm going to show you how even that can change. But let's go ahead and take a look at a quick demonstration of fixing up our previous function and going with the more modular approach. Okay, so we have our simple controller here, but this isn't really modular. It's just kind of a function out there. And so what I'm going to do is come into here, and let's just call this demo app. And we'll say angular.module, and we're going to go ahead and give it demo app. Now, doesn't have to be the same name as my variable, but I'm going to go ahead and do that. And again, the empty brackets here for the array mean I have no dependencies that I need to worry about. Now, I'm going to go ahead and leave this guy as is to show you how this works, and then I'll change it. So I'm going to come down now, and we can now take our module and say, let's add and notice for the C's, we have config, constructor, controller. So we're going to do a controller, and let's name it simple controller. Now what I'm going to do is actually give it simple controller here, because I could give it an anonymous function, or I could actually create the controller outside and then just assign it in, and that would work absolutely fine. Now, this already knows about simple controller, but ng app doesn't know about demo app. So let's go ahead and fix that by saying demo app. All right, so now we're ready to go. Now this is a little more modular, I should say. So first off, let me make sure this runs. and then I'll show you the kind of anonymous way to do it. And you can see it still works, and we can filter and do all that. Okay, now the next piece of this is you may not even want to keep it outside. Now, in some cases you may, and I'll show you one more trick to wrap up in a second here, but I'm just going to do an anonymous function right in my simple controller because the ng app, demo app here, knows about this. It then knows about the controller. So simple controller, the string, is known here, and now this should run exactly the same way. Really shouldn't be any difference at all. You can see that loads in great there. All right, so that's an example of actually creating a module with a controller. Now, another cool trick you can do, and this can be useful in, depends on how you like to write your JavaScript, I think, is I'm gonna wipe out all of this, and I'm gonna come in and just create a variable called controllers, and just give it a kind of empty object literal to start here. Then we're gonna say controllers.simpleController, give it the same name as what I had before, equals, and then I'm going to give it the function, and then we'll kind of do a semicolon. Okay, now I could do multiples of these. If I had multiple controllers, I could say controllers, controller2 equals a function. Now I'll go ahead and leave it at 1. But now what I can do is I can come in and just pass controllers. Now, because this is named simple controller, it's a property obviously off of the object, this will still be able to find it. And so by doing this technique, some people like this better, some people don't. We can come in and you see we get the same exact feature, still works the same. And so there's 3 ways you could do it. So one way is you could create an external function and just pass the function in with the controller name. The second way is you could actually pass a name as a string with an anonymous function. And then the third way is we could come in and do this type of technique. And some people like this because now I can, it's a little easier to prototype things if I needed to and that type of stuff. So that's an example of using a module with a controller. Now, once you've defined a module and a controller, at some point if you're building a single page application, you're going to need routes because we need to load different views into our shell page. Now, this would be an example of 4 different routes. So we have when view 1 is clicked, maybe there's a link, and that's the link to it is something like /view1. Typically you'll have a hash, but you'll see that coming up. That will load that view. And then when they click on a link that has view 2 in the path, then that would load view 2, but it's not going to reload the whole shell page. Angular will only load the piece that you want it. So there's 2 kind of ways you can load it. First off, the view could be embedded as a script template in the actual shell page. And then we could just tell Angular, hey, the template ID to load, or it's kind of like saying the view ID is, X. The second way is back up on the server, you might actually have all these views, and I like to call them partials because they're part of a page. And you could tell Angular the template URL for what I want to load. And then you give it the URL to the server, and I'm going to show that coming up here. Now, this is a really important feature because we want to be able to go in and load different partials or fragments, and then that will be kind of how our SPA works. So what we're going to do is use that config that I showed earlier. So we have Angular module is demo app, no dependencies. And now what I'm going to do is configure the module with some routes. Now, another object that's available in Angular is called the route provider, as you see here. And it's kind of like the scope. It's injected in dynamically just by defining $route provider as your parameter. So in this case, we're going to say, hey, the route provider, when the route is just a slash, the root, we want to use simple controller with view1.html. When the route is /partial2, we want to use same controller in this case, but you could certainly do a different one with template URL of view2. Now the template URL, you might, give it a folder where these partials live, and I actually like to call my folder partials, but you don't have to. And then otherwise, if it doesn't meet any of those routes, we're going to redirect back to the root, which ultimately goes back up to here, and we would load view1. So this is a really cool thing, and once it kind of clicks and you have that light bulb moment, this is really the magic to glue a view to a controller so that scope gets passed and we can do the data binding and the directives appropriately. So let's go fix up what we have so far and let's convert this into more of a spa type of application. So far in our application, we've created a module and we've assigned that to our ng app so it knows how to get to that. And then that module has this simple controller. And so now we have the view knowing about simple controller. And that's fine and it works, but that can quickly get out of control and really have some code duplication here when you really don't need it. So let's go ahead and on our module, let's add in our config. So we can say demo app.config, and now in here, we can give it a new route or multiple routes. So I'm just gonna paste in some code for this to save a little typing. And so when we have demo app.config, we have our route provider, and the route provider says, hey, when we're just kind of at the root for our route, then use simple controller and go to partials view1 HTML. Now partials view1 HTML is right here, and you'll see it's very, very simple. We have view1, we have our same filtering and our same looping that we did earlier. So really nothing different there. And then we also have view2. Says view2, and we're just gonna kind of pretend we filter by city instead. So nothing real fancy there, just enough to make it a little bit different. Now they're both gonna use the same controller in this case, but in a real life app, that may or may not be the case. Certainly I'd offer that most of the time I have kind of a one-to-one relationship between controllers, but it depends on how much reuse you can get out of one. But in this case, we're just gonna use simple controller, which has our customers. Now, what I want to do though is let's come into view1 and let's fix it up just a little bit. And I want to make it so that under each customer here, let's just add a BR, we can enter a customer name. And then I'm just going to paste this into here. And we'll go ahead and let's separate those. And then I also want to come in and make it so you can enter a customer city. And so we'll say city right here. And we'll change these guys. Now we already have name, that's our filter. Now normally I like to do filter.name and then change this to filter.name, and that keeps it really clear. And then on here, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna call this customer.name, or just to make it really obvious, let's say new customer.name. And what that'll do is it's gonna create a new property on the scope that then has a sub property called name. So we'll say new customer.name, and or actually city in this case. And then the final thing we need is a button. We haven't seen how to interact with our controller yet, so let's go ahead and take a look. So I'm gonna add just a standard good old button, and another directive we can use is called ng-click. Now if you go to the documentation for Angular, there are several different options here. ng-click is just one of them, and I'm gonna call add customer. And then we'll call this add customer. Pretty obvious. So once this view loads, once we get that working, we should be able to add a customer in. Now, obviously in our controller, we need to be able to handle that. So let's go back to our controller, and because we called this add customer, and because the view binds to the scope, then we need to say scope.add customer and assign that to a function. Now, you'll notice that I'm not having to pass in the data. I don't even have to look at the text boxes because the scope already has that. Okay, we can get to everything through this. And so what I'm gonna do is we're gonna say scope.customers.push, and let's push in a new item into the array. So we'll say name is scope dot, or new customer name. So let me add the scope dot here. And let's go ahead and wrap this down so you can see it better. And then a comma, and we'll do city is scope.newCustomer.city. And then end our object literal there. And we're off and running, that's it. That's all we have to do to make this work. And it makes it really easy to now interact back from the view into the controller, but yet this doesn't even know about the controller. In fact, you'll notice there's no controller definition here. That's gonna happen through the route. That will then call our add customer, and it'll simply show up in our list, our LIs that we have. Okay, so that's kind of one thing I wanted to show, and now that we have the routes, we're kind of ready to go, but we have a little bit more work. So what I'm gonna do is this little using directives with data binding page here, I'm gonna pretty much kill off most of this. So we're going to get rid of all that. I don't need the controller anymore because the views will just use those. And what I'm going to do is add a special directive called ngView. Now, normally there's a couple ways you can do this. You might see it like this, ngView as a tag. You could do that, but I kind of feel more comfortable doing div, and then I can do my data dash ngView, and normally you just leave it like that, but I'm going to go ahead and add it equals just because most people are used to that with HTML5 data dash attributes. Now, this represents the placeholder for the views. Okay, so now when my routes kick in and we go to a default route, what'll happen is the partials view1 HTML is going to be married to the controller. That's then going to be injected dynamically into this div. And so I don't have to write the DOM code to do that. It's just going to magically happen behind the scenes. And now we're starting to get into a spa type of concept here. So if we go up, just as a review, our ng app has demo app. We now have our ng view, which represents our placeholder. We have our module with our config and our routes. And assuming I named everything okay, we should be all right here. Let's say that this is view 2. And we're going to reference that in just a second. And then we have our controller where we can bind customers. Then we provide a way to add to it. So what I'm going to do real quick, though, is I realized I didn't add a link here. So let's say at the bottom that we had a hyperlink. And let's say when this is clicked, we want to go to that route. And we'll say view 2 on this. So when you click it, this will direct Angular to actually kick in the router. And then that router, of course, will take us over to view 2. So it'll be pretty standard here. Okay, so now we've really cleaned this guy up. Now, the last thing I would do, which I'll show you in the more realistic app, is I would take all this out and make separate scripts and load those. But we'll go ahead and leave it here for demo's sake. All right, so now that view 1 is here, notice I don't have to put ng controller because it's going to map that up automatically for both views. So let's give it a shot and we'll see if there's any errors or typos here. And you can see that view 1 has now loaded here. Now I actually tweaked the route just a little bit just to show you. I had a slash, which I could do, but I also wanted to show that instead of having just a slash there for the root, I'm going to redirect to view 1, or if you prefer, you could just do this, and that would be the default view. So either way would work, but I'll go ahead and we'll put view 1 back in here. Now that automatically loads it. Now here's what's really cool. Not only does this manage our routing for us, and as this loads, you're going to see that it still works, and you can see our context is bound. We get our customers. I can still filter and do all that. I can come in, and let's go ahead and add a customer here. So watch our list. We'll do add customer, and there we go. Notice it sorted it. And now when I click on view 2, watch the path up here. What it's going to do is automatically navigate to view 2. Again, I can still filter because these both have the same controller and therefore the same scope. But when I hit back, it's actually going to go back to view 1. And I can go back and forward, and Angular is automatically managing that history for me, which is a really, really nice feature to have available. So that's an example of we can actually come in, define a module, define some routes, and then go in and on those routes, hook up a controller to a view, and now Angular will automatically load those routes for us. Now that you've seen how to create modules and how modules can then be used to define routes and also to work with controllers, we're going to wrap up by talking about some reuse concepts. So another feature of AngularJS is the ability to encapsulate data functionality into factories, services providers, or little value providers. Now, I'm going to focus on factories here, but all three of the top ones shown here, factories, services, and providers, they allow us to encapsulate common functionality. So for instance, if I had to go get customers and I need those customers in multiple controllers, well, then I wouldn't want to hard code that data in each controller. It just wouldn't make sense and it'd be a lot of duplication there. So instead, what I'll do is I'll move that code out to a factory, service, or provider. Now, the difference between the three is just the way in which they create the object that goes and gets the data. And that's really all there is to it. With a factory, you actually create an object inside of the factory and return it. With the service, you actually just have a standard function that uses the this keyword to define functions. And with the provider, there's a $get function you define, and it can be used to get the object that returns the data. A value is just a way to get a simple, for instance, config value. So a simple example you'll see of this on the Angular site is you might just want the version of a particular script. And so you'd have a name value pair where the name of the value might be version, and then the value would be, say, 1.4. So I'm not going to cover all those here, but I am going to cover factories. So let's take a look at how we can use a module to define a factory. So in this example, you'll see that down below I have the controller that we looked at earlier. And notice that instead of hard coding the customers in here, or if it was an AJAX call, instead of hard coding that call into the controller, I'm going to use our module up here to define a factory. Now in this case, you'll see I'm actually using chaining. So the module is defined, and then instead of putting a semicolon, we just chain factory, and then once that's done, we chain controller. You don't have to do that, but that is certainly an option. So in this factory, we're going to give it a name, and what the factory is going to do in this case is provide a way to get customers. So let's assume we have some customers variable up here, and what we want to do is create a factory object, define a method on it that returns this customer variable. Now, in a real-life app, this get customers might actually go out and make an async call. And then that async call data returns, and then returns it to the controller or controllers that needs it. Now, what's really cool about factories, services, and providers is that once you've defined it, you can then inject it very easily as a parameter into something like a controller or even another factory if you want it. So a factory could rely on another factory. So if we come down to our controller here, you'll see that simple controller does our standard scope, but notice that the second parameter is simple factory. Well, that little name matches up there on purpose. What AngularJS is going to do at runtime is dynamically inject this into the controller. So now I'll have access to this factory object that's returned out of this function, and now I can say factory.getCustomers. And so this provides dependency injection, and it provides a way that I now have a centralized place to go get customer data, order data, whatever it may be. And in a real-life app, you certainly may have several different factories in the application itself. So let's jump into a demo, and I'm going to convert the customers we had in our controller before and move those out into just a really simple factory to help get you started. Earlier I showed how we can create a module, define our routes, and then have a controller in that module called Simple Controller, but you'll notice that the customers are hard-coded. Now, in a real-life app, you actually may have something hard-coded, I suppose, but in general, we're probably going to go off to a server or service to actually go and get the data via AJAX or some other type of technique, maybe even WebSockets. So what I'm going to do is move these customers out. We don't want to hard-code these, obviously, and we can kind of pretend that we're going to go call a service. So I'm just going to go ahead and say that customers is right now just an empty array. Now what I'm going to do is, under the routes here, I'm going to define a factory. Now you'll notice as I type factory, it shows up in the nice IntelliSense. I could also do a service or a provider. So there's 3 different options for doing this, and again, they all differ just in how they create and return the object that serves up the data. But a factory I think is really easy to understand and get started with. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to call this simple factory, and we're going to give it our function. Now I'm going to do an empty function here, but keep in mind with Angular, as for instance scope is dynamically injected, we can also inject other things. If I wanted to make an AJAX call, then I can tell Angular inject in the Angular HTTP object, and then I could do HTTP get, put, post, and delete type of calls to, for instance, RESTful APIs. Now in this case I'm not going to do that. We're going to keep it really kind of fundamental and simple. But I'm going to come in and define some customers, and I'm just going to assign those customers we had earlier. Let's make that customers. Now what I'm going to do is with a factory, you create an object, tack on some functions to it, and then return that object out of the function. With the service, you don't create an object. The function is the object. You just tack on, using the this keyword, some functions. So I'll kind of show you the difference here. So we're going to come in and say factory equals, and just create an empty object here. Now what I'm going to do is factory dot, and let's call it get customers. And get customers is simply going to come in and do nothing more than, and actually I didn't want to do it that way. I want to do a function here. And I'm just going to return customers. Now, had I passed in an HTTP object, or if you're using jQuery or whatever it may be, I can make the AJAX call right here. And then once it comes back, we could return a promise and get into all that fun stuff with async calls. But in this case, we're just going to return something really simple. So now our factory has a get customers. We might also have factory dot, maybe put customer if we wanted. If we want to do updates, or post customer, or whatever you want to call it. And maybe this would take our actual customer object, and then we would have code in here to actually do something with it. All right, in this case though, we'll just stick with the customers. Now, regardless of whatever you put on with a factory, once you create the factory object, simply return it. Now, if this were said service right here, then instead of factory dot, this becomes the factory. All right, this function here. So I would just say this dot get customers and this dot, and then that factory itself would be in the function. But I kind of like factories because you actually control the object itself, and you don't really have to use the this keyword and things. All right, so we're kind of ready to go here. We now have a factory that returns some, in this case, hard-coded customers. Now we need to fill them. So how do we do that? Well, I need to first get a reference up here to the factory. Now all you do is you take the name, so I'm going to put that in my clipboard, and I'll just put comma, and then you put that name in. And what Angular will do is go look up that factory automatically and inject it in for us. And that's all you have to do is just put the name. So it's very modular. Now here I could say simple factory dot get customers, but let's say that we kind of have a whole initialization routine we want to do. So I usually will do something like this. I'll just make a kind of a private function here. We'll call it a init. And I'll say scope.customers equals that. And then all we have to do is call init. Now you don't have to do it that way at all. I just prefer all my initialization for my data routines or factory calls to be in kind of one nice little place. So I might have multiple lines in here that kind of kick off the process to get the initial maybe lookup data, for instance, for dropdowns that my controller passes down to my view. So that's kind of why I like to do it this way. Okay, now other than this, there's really nothing in the view that's going to change because the view doesn't even know about any of this. It just knows about ultimately the controller and the scope. And the way we did our views, it really doesn't even know about the controller because it's dynamically assigned. So let's go ahead and run this, and we should see that our customers actually load up, and there they are. They're now coming from the factory though. We can go to view 2. These are also coming from the factory. So now we're not having to duplicate data, assuming we did have 2 controllers here. We have them all in one nice little reusable factory. That is an example of getting started with factories in AngularJS. Now that you've seen the core components involved with AngularJS, I'm going to wrap up with just a real quick demo that I put together. And this was put together just over a few hours that demonstrates some of these features in action. So let me first pull up the application, and this is just a real little spa app, single page application that shows some different customers. So I can come in and add in customers if I'd like. And we can go ahead and add that, and you'll see it alphabetizes them and all that. So I go here, I can remove it back out, and I can then click on orders. So we'll go to Lee Carroll. That'll take me into a separate page, a separate view actually, but it didn't reload the whole shell page. Go back to customers and go over to orders and see all the customer orders here. And this is just using a couple things. So first off, we have AngularJS, of course, and it's also using a little bit of jQuery because I'm doing Bootstrap. So we have Bootstrap, jQuery, and Angular. Now I'm not using jQuery for much of really anything, just a few basic things so that we can work with some of the Bootstrap stuff I'm doing. All right, so this particular app, this is the shell page, and you can see that we have some Bootstrap up top as well as my styles. We have my navigation, and here is the view. Now I did a little custom directive, and this is an animated view that slides things in. Now starting with version, and I put a comment here about it, 1.14 of Angular, the ability to animate your views as they get put in will automatically come out of the box. You just have to supply some CSS styles and that'll kick in. But this also shows how to do a directive. So if you're interested, I show how to write a custom directive there. And all I did was took what AngularJS already had for the ng view and just tweaked it to use the jQuery animation features. Now from there, moving on down, you'll notice that I just have some scripts. So the only core, what I'd call library scripts, are Angular and jQuery. We then have Bootstrap for UI scripts, and then here's my custom. Now I put all the controllers just in one file to keep it real simple here, but you could certainly break these out, and you can see that everything is in an app folder. So if we go up to app, you'll see controllers, directives, partials, services, and then app.js you're going to see is kind of what kicks everything off. So let's start there. So app.js is where we come in and define our module. So you can see I have customers app, doesn't have any dependencies, and then I have my different routes for my customers, my customer orders, and my order screen. You can even see I'm demonstrating how to pass parameters up here on the URL using a route parameter. So that's in here as well if you're interested. So that's kind of the default configuration that you can see. And then there's a little bit of details here about how I kind of like to break things up in general. Now, if we come over to the controllers, this is where I have all my controllers here. And so you can see I have customers controller, we have customers orders controller or customer orders controller, and then we should have an orders controller down here. And then I have just a really simple one for a nav controller. Now these are all built off of the module, so they're part of it. Notice they inject in a few things that the app needs here, including a factory. And so this is all pretty standard stuff that you've already seen. The factory, or in this case, the service, I wanted to show both ways of doing it. So in the demos, I showed a factory. Here's an example of a service. Really the same thing, except for, as I mentioned earlier, you use the this keyword to define your different functions here, you can see. Now in this case, the data is hard-coded, so it's not making an AJAX call, but this would give you the foundation for building a service, or you could do a factory, either one. I actually tend to prefer factories for some reason myself, but this one I decided to try services out. My views are in a little partials folder, and this is just going to be the little simple parts that get injected in to the animated view. So these are my kind of spa subpages, if you will, that get injected in and we bind to the scope. You can see some data binding here. So there's quite a bit more that I could walk through here, but this is something I wanted to show real quick, just to show a simple example of getting started with AngularJS and how you can use it to actually interact, do data binding, do factories, controllers, and all that fun type of stuff. Well, that is the end. I hope that by watching this video you have a really good solid feel for the different pieces of Angular and the power that it really does offer. I'm really excited about the framework. We're building some different apps using it and liking the overall process, flow, and modularity it provides. As kind of a summary here, it really is a SPA framework, but it depends on what you're doing. If you just want it for data binding with the injection, you could do that if you want it as well. Some of the key features as a review, we talked about directives and filters. So directives enhance our HTML. We talked about things like ng repeat, ng app, ng controller, ng init, and there's many others. And then we talked about how we can filter data and also how we can do two-way data binding. From there, I showed you how we can hook up views of controllers and that really the glue between those as far as the data binding goes is the scope. And the scope is really another word for a view model that some of you might be familiar with. And then finally, we wrapped up with modules and routes, and I also threw in factories at the end there to show how we can first off define a container. That container can then have one or more routes in it, one or more controllers, different factories, and then we can link that app or module into our main shell view using the ng app directive. So that's a wrap on the content that I had planned in the 60-ish minutes, since I know I'm over that. Now, as far as other resources out there that I'd recommend you take a look at, there are definitely a lot of cool things out there. And one of those will be the sample code. And this will just have some of the basic samples I ran through as well as the app I showed at the end. And so you can go to tinyurl.com/AngularJS demos. Now, aside from that, a lot of great stuff out there that I don't have time to go into. We did visit AngularJS, but built with AngularJS has a lot of samples of Angular in action. And then if you wanted to get some different plugins, whether it's Bootstrap or jQuery, there's some sites out there with some directives that'll make this really easy to integrate. Now, as far as learning, I do a lot of work with a site and company called Pluralsight. Awesome company, very cool people run it. And this is online video training. Now, at the time I filmed this, or else I would have listed them, there's not any Angular courses, but they are being worked on as we speak. My good friends, Jim Cooper and Joe Eames, are working on an AngularJS fundamentals course that'll be up there shortly. And then I'm currently working with Scott Allen, developer extraordinaire Scott Allen, on an end-to-end Angular course that'll show you the whole process with a real app and how that all works. So feel free to check that out if you're interested. In the meantime, feel free to check out some of my posts at weblogs.asp.net/dwalleen or get in touch via Twitter. I appreciate your time and watching the video.